You're listening to the Biddy Tarot podcast, and this is episode 31, Tarot for Elevating Global Consciousness.
Welcome to the Biddy Tarot podcast, where you'll learn how to connect more deeply with your intuition and live an empowered and enlightened life with the tarot cards as your guide. Listen as Bridget and her guests share their very best tips and strategies to help you read tarot with confidence. And now, here's your host, Bridget Esselmont.
Hello, and welcome back to the Biddy Tarot podcast. Well, most of the time, we consult the tarot cards for issues and concerns that relate to ourselves. For example, what do I need to know about my career or my relationship? But did you know that tarot can also be used for issues and concerns that relate to us as a global community? In today's podcast, I'm going to show you how you can ask deep and profound questions about world events and themes. And in doing so, how you can elevate global consciousness through your tarot practice. And yes, it is truly possible. So let's get into it. Well, this podcast has really been inspired by the two previous podcasts. So in episode 29, I was talking about this connection between collective wisdom and individual wisdom, particularly as it relates to tarot. And when we're working with tarot, we are connecting in with both. And on that collective wisdom side, there is also this idea of connecting into the bigger collective, the bigger group around us, rather than simply just thinking about what's impacting or affecting ourselves. And then to add to that, I had the conversation with James Wells in episode 30. And I'm always enjoying my conversations with James because somehow he always has me thinking of things in a very different way. And what stood out to me in that conversation was this idea of using tarot not just to ask loads of questions about ourselves, but to ask these bigger questions about the world around us and, bigger issues that might be impacting us. Because I don't know about you, but I often think about myself and what's happening in my world and what's affecting me. And, more often than not, my tarot readings are just about me. That sounds terrible, doesn't it? But I do hope that you can relate. It takes kind of a different level of thinking to go, well, maybe I could ask about, what's going on in the world around us. And this isn't, necessarily like what's going on in my ex-boyfriend's life, that kind of thing. I'm talking about really big global themes here. And so, that's what I'm focusing today's podcast on, is how we can take that thinking with our tarot beyond just ourselves and instead, refocus it on some of these bigger issues in life. And, I talk about elevating global consciousness. I suppose what I mean here is that the more energy and attention we can give to these bigger global issues, I think the more that we can change things from an energetic or a consciousness level. So not necessarily that we're like having to get in there and do something. And oftentimes it's very hard with global issues because you do feel that sense of helplessness and what can I do about this problem? But instead, what we can do is we can tap into that collective consciousness and we can help transform and shift the level of global consciousness around these major issues. So if that sounds like something of interest, then definitely stick with me through this, because I'm going to walk you through a way that you can work with your tarot cards in order to connect in with these global issues and understand what's going on with them. So let's get into it. Now, if you've got your tarot cards handy, that would be awesome. If you don't worry. I'm going to walk you through this, method along with an example tarot reading. So the first thing that you want to do is think about a world event or a global issue. So this might be something, just that you've been hearing in the news a lot, perhaps, or it could be something that you are truly passionate about. Perhaps, maybe it's child labor and that's something that you want to see abolished or, you know, proactively dealt with. Perhaps it's poverty, maybe it's the financial crisis, whatever it might be. Or you might tune into an event, something that has occurred, perhaps a specific act of terrorism or, a major accident that may have happened that has, maybe left you feeling a little bit unsettled or has left the people around you feeling quite unsettled as well. So, really just choose something that has some level of importance to you and where you would like to see change and transformation. Now, the issue that I've chosen for our example today is terrorism. Now, it's not the most friendliest of topics, but it is something that I think is coming into our view so frequently. Every now and then I check on CNN, when I'm tired at night and I have a look at the news on my phone and I look at CNN and it's most often about, ISIS and the terrorism that's happening there and around the world. And I can't help but feel us as a society being impacted by this idea of terrorism. And I think if it affects me most and affects others most is there is a strong sense of helplessness. What do we do about this major problem? And there's also a level of fear. Will I be affected by terrorism? Will my loved ones be affected by it, directly or even indirectly? So, yeah, I've chosen terrorism for our topic today. Certainly not a light topic, that's for sure. So, think about what topic you might choose. Okay, number two is to brainstorm a series of questions about the topic that you've chosen. Now, the important thing when you're brainstorming these questions is to be curious and not fatalistic or dramatic. So, for example, I could go down the path of of asking the tarot, are we all going to die from terrorists? Or is the world going to end because of terrorism? That's one path I could choose, but I don't find that particularly helpful. And I find my energy around those kinds of questions becomes quite stressed, and it's not where I really want to focus my energy. So, here are a couple of questions that I've brainstormed around terrorism. And again, coming at it from the perspective of being curious and trying to understand the concept of terrorism in this present moment. So, one question might be, what is terrorism? Another one might be, what role does terrorism play in our world? What lesson are we learning as a global community through terrorism? Now, I know you might be listening particularly to those last two questions and think, what are you talking about, Bridget? Terrorism is awful. Like, how could it even have a role in our world? Well, I guess what I want to do here is I want to understand, it's existing. This issue is here. And I'm curious to understand why. Why are we experiencing this issue? What is it that we can learn from this issue? And, again, this might apply to anything: child labor, poverty, financial crisis. Why are these global issues present and in our consciousness right now? Another question I might ask is, what does world peace look like? Because for me, the absence of terrorism is world peace. And so I wonder what that might look like. And in fact, I could even ask the question of, what does the absence of terrorism look like? Because maybe it's not world peace, maybe it's actually something else. Maybe I've made an assumption there. Another assumption, I guess, that I've made with this question is, what does acceptance look like? I'm assuming that in the absence of terrorism, there may be acceptance of diversity and different cultures and so on. Now, the last two questions that I've come up with here, more action oriented. And, the one thing that really frustrates me with global issues is I typically feel a strong sense of helplessness. There is nothing I can do. You know, What can I personally do about terrorism? Well, that's actually a question. That's a question for the tarot. What can I personally do about terrorism? Because I do feel this sense of helplessness, and I wonder, I'm curious to see, what does the tarot have to say on this? And in a similar vein, what can we as a global community do about terrorism? Curious to see what the tarot comes up with for that. So, once you've brainstormed your sort of curious questions, choose a few that you want to use in your tarot reading. You might find that some sort of overlap, or you have more interest in some versus others. So just pick out a few that you want to explore. Okay, step number 3 is select a tarot deck. Now, had this been a couple of years ago, I would have just skipped this step completely because I'd be using the Rider-Waite, no questions asked. But as I've come to appreciate different tarot decks, I also appreciate that different decks have different energy. And when we're considering a particularly big topic like global issues or terrorism, it's important to choose a deck that resonates energetically with that issue. Now, if I was to think about this, maybe I could use the Gaian Tarot. I love the Gaian Tarot. And the reason being that it's quite soulful and earth based. Or I could use the Rider Waite, and I particularly resonate with its pragmatic energy. And so in this case, I have decided to go with a Rider Waite, and I've made a conscious choice about that. But think about all of the tarot decks that you own. Which one would be most helpful for you in exploring this global issue? Okay, so now we get into the fun stuff, and that is actually doing the reading. So, if you've got your tarot cards on hand and you've got some questions that you'd like to ask about your global issue, then let's get right into it. Now, I've got my cards here. So, I haven't prepared this one earlier. We're going to see what just sort of turns up as we go. So, the first question I'm going to ask is, what is terrorism? And I have to admit, I am a little bit nervous about what might come up here. Who knows? Like, we are doing this completely live. Well, live right now, recorded once it's in your earbuds. Okay, so what is terrorism? Okay. The Five of Swords. Interesting. Okay, so as I'm looking at the Rider-Waite deck in the Five of Swords, I see two people walking away. Their swords are on the ground, and it's as if a battle is over and has ended. And there's another man in the foreground who's picking up those swords. And he's sort of looking over his shoulder at the other two who appear quite upset about the battle being lost. And, this brings us back to, what is terrorism? Now, interestingly, the fives are about tension and conflict. That's pretty clear. But the biggest energy that I get from this card is that it's about loss and winning at all costs in some ways, and making sure that someone else is losing. So for me, this is a sign that, terrorism is about winners and losers and creating conflict in order for there to be losers. So you can see how that starts to fit. And, as you explore this global issue, it just gives you a new lens to look at that issue. This isn't the one and only definition of terrorism. You heard it right here on the Biddy Tarot podcast. No, this is simply about giving you a deeper appreciation for these global issues. Okay, the next question I want to ask is, well, what role does terrorism play in our world? Again, feeling somewhat nervous about what might come up. What role does terrorism play in our world? The Five of Cups. So again, we've got another five, another card about change, conflict, tension. And in the Five of Cups, we again have this theme of loss. And it's so fascinating to compare these two cards. So in the Five of Cups, we see a man with his head down, very similar to the two losers, I would say, from the Five of Swords. They've both got their heads down, back turned, and in that place of loss and grief. And in the Five of Cups, there are three cups that are overturned, whereas in the Five of Swords, the two swords lay on the ground. They're kind of like the missed opportunities or what has been lost. But as with the Five of Swords, in the Five of Cups, there are two upstanding cups. And perhaps, the role, coming back to what role does terrorism play in the world? Well, in some weird, strange way, it may be giving us hope. Don't tell me, don't ask me where that came from, but I almost feel like the shadow side of terrorism is in the hope that it creates. It's really odd. But as we experience, I guess, that fear and loss and grief around terrorism, there may be the emergence of hope of a better world, perhaps. So, again, this isn't necessarily the be all and end all answer. This is more to stretch your mind around these global issues. And so that, in this case, I'm asking myself, how does hope emerge from terrorism? That's a really interesting concept. Who knows? Okay, the next question I want to ask is, what does the absence of terrorism look like? Let's see. What does the absence of terrorism look like? Oh, strength. I love it when my tarot cards play properly. So the strength card, you know what I love, love, love about this card is this young maiden. She's soft and gentle, and yet she can exert her power and influence over this ferocious lion. And so the absence of terrorism doesn't necessarily mean the absence of power and control, but it's that power and control are expressed in a different way, in a much more subtle, persuasive way than through force, which we know is related to terrorism. And I even get the sense of, this divine feminine coming through and the embracing of sacred feminine energy. And perhaps that's what might emerge in the absence of terrorism. Very interesting. Okay, so let's now ask, what can I personally do about terrorism? Because this is, I suppose, where I feel that sense of helplessness. What can I personally do? The world. Oh, this could be interpreted in so many different ways. So I suppose in one way, it's a reflection of what we're actually doing here. And we are looking at a world global issue. And we are sort of connecting our energy around that issue in a wholesome way. So perhaps what I can personally do about terrorism is look at it from a whole perspective. And in doing that, that may further my understanding of terrorism and that may energetically shift how I interact with this concept. So let's see now, as a global community, what can we do about terrorism? Okay, the Two of Wands. Okay, so the thing that just occurred to me, when I look at the Two of Wands, I see the man in his castle and he's firmly within the bounds of his castle. He's holding a world in his hand and he's aware of the world that's around him, but he stays where he is. And, sometimes I think this is about, I hope I don't say the wrong things here, but I think it's about knowing where our boundaries are. And, instead of trying to occupy other places that, maybe we're not welcome, then perhaps it's just about staying little bit more in our sort of safety zones and respecting that other communities or societies have their own zones as well. Now, I wish that we could, live in a world where it's completely borderless and we are all from the same place, absolutely. But I wonder if this is more of an interim measure to say, you know what, as a global community, we kind of need to just stick to our own area, but also have an appreciation for the world around us. So not try to, barge into other communities and societies and convince them of a specific philosophy or way of thinking, but just be connected to how different societies operate, but not having to necessarily change those different societies. I also see, the Two of Wands very much around, world summits. So maybe we're going to see more around like world summits around terrorism and dealing with terrorism, and particularly dealing with geographical boundaries in this card. So there you have it. My goodness, I did not quite expect this to go where it went, but I'm so glad it did because this is incredibly insightful. And I really hope that when you do this reading for whatever issue you choose, you'll also find it very insightful too. Now, we've laid out 5 cards here on the topic of terrorism. I want to wrap this up with a little bit more of like a healing process. Now, I'm not going to use the tarot for this. I'm going to use the Rumi Oracle deck, Rumi, Rumi. And I've chosen this deck because it's a very divine deck. And the beauty of the deck is that it also comes with like a healing ritual. So I'm going to ask the deck what card, just basically, what card do we need here? When it comes to terrorism, what is the message that this oracle speaks? And therefore, what healing process can we connect in with? Okay, so, oh my goodness. So I've chosen the card called The Right Choice. Now, it appears to be like an ascended master in this card. I'm going to have a look. Let's just see. Okay, so let me read you. This is a poem from Rumi which is related to this card, and it is this: Stay close to those who know about the heart. Choose the shade of a tree that is in constant bloom. Don't meander aimlessly among herb sellers and potion vendors. Go directly to the shop that sells nothing but sweets. Don't sit waiting by every boiling pot to have your plate filled. Not every boiling pot is cooking what you want. Not every sugar cane is filled with sugar. Not every down has an up. Not every eye has vision. And not every sea contains pearls. And with this comes the advice. Within you, I recognize my most trusted friend. We go back a long way to before that moment when time began. We knew each other then, even before time was born. So I say, hello, my old and dear friend. So lovely for us to meet again. And I feel how your heart responds with a wave of love, for it is that love that is you, my most trusted friend. And so what I see here is the message with this card is that if we can come from a place of love, then this whole issue of terrorism goes away. And if we can align ourselves with that loving energy and people who generate loving energy, then it almost just fades away in the background. And it really does come to making the right choice and a love-based choice as well. Now, I want to share with you the sacred honoring ritual that goes along with this card. And I want us to see this like as a healing process around terrorism and using this process to help us heal on a global level. So turn the palms of your hands down towards the earth and say aloud, with gratitude and trust, I release that which is not rightfully mine. Now open your hands upwards towards the sky and say aloud, I give thanks for the grace that is bestowed upon me now as I accept my rightful divine inheritance. Now stand with your hands in prayer at your heart and say aloud, I honour my heart wisdom. May my heart always be my leading light. Show me the way of grace. So be it. And you've completed your honouring ritual. And that, my friend, also wraps up this reading around terrorism and terrorism as a global issue. And I hope that, by sharing this with you, you are also inspired to create your own reading around a global issue that's important to you. And use this as an opportunity, one, to be curious and to elevate your level of thinking about that global issue, but also to elevate the global consciousness around that issue and to change, the energy and the sort of global vibration, I suppose, around that particular issue. So I hope that you have enjoyed this. And well, just on cue, we have a cleansing rain in the background. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to hear that, but it's quite beautiful. Now, if you love this podcast, I would love for you to head on over to iTunes and leave a review. You can also subscribe to get the latest podcast. And look, if you're not on an iPhone, but you're on a different kind of phone, do they even exist? No, you can also download and subscribe via Stitcher. So just search for the Biddy Tarot podcast on Stitcher as well. Or you can head to the blog at biddytarot.com/31 and you can continue the conversation there. And, I'd love to hear how your readings have gone with this global issues tarot spread that I've shared with you today. All right, well, that's it for today. Thank you so much, and I look forward to connecting with you again soon. Thanks and goodbye.